Okay. Good morning and Happy New Year to all attendees, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, on behalf of the committee, I would like to welcome and thank you to our dear Sobat Sino Forum and the honorable guests who have taken the time to attend today's seminar presented by Master of Communication Science and Master of International Relations Program, Faculty of Social and Political Science, Pelita Harapan University, in collaboration with Indonesia Sinology Forum. First, let me introduce myself. My name is Stephanie Priscilia, a junior researcher at Indonesian Sinology Forum who had the opportunities to be the Master of Ceremonies for today's discussions event. This is the first seminar that the Indonesian Sinology Forum held in this year and the fourth seminar collaborations with Pelita Harapan University. It is an honor for us, the Indonesian Sinology Forum, to have another discussions with Pelita Harapan University, and we really look forward to another collaborations discussion ahead. So today's topic discussions will be about from TAOJIN to TANGPING, Southeast Asian Chinese migrations and the waves of China's re-globalizations. First, let me give you a brief introductions about one of the host institutions. Indonesian Sinology Forum, or FSI, is an institution that facilitates research and observations on China, its relationships with Indonesia, and the Chinese community as an integral part of the Indonesian nation. Written research results can be accessed through our website at forumsinology.id. And in addition to our articles, we also disseminate these issues through online and offline seminars, which can be viewed on our YouTube channel, the Indonesian Sinology Forum. And for the latest updates on China selected by FSI or another FSI events, please follow us on Instagram at Sinoforum. And not only to all attendees, I would like also to extend our warm welcome to our honorable speakers of today's seminar, Professor Dr. Pal Nyiri, who is ready to share his views on today's issues. And we would also like to extend our respectful greetings to all honorable guests who have participated in this morning's sessions. To officially begin Open Today events, I would like to invite Professor Dr. Edwin Martua Bangun Tambunan, SIP MSI, Dean of the Faculty of Social and Political Science, Pelita Harapan University, and Professor of Security and Peace Studies, to deliver his opening speech.
Distinguished professors, honorable moderator, esteemed colleagues, dear students, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and welcome to this seminar entitled From TAOJIN to TANGPING, Southeast Asia Chinese Migrations and the Waves of China's Re-globalizations. On behalf of the Faculty of Social and Political Sciences, Universitas Pelita Harapan, I would like to express my sincere gratitude to all of you for taking the time to be with us today. This seminar is jointly organized by the Forum Sinologi Indonesia in collaborations with the Master's Program in International Relations and the Master Programs in Communication Science at Universitas Pelita Harapan. We are delighted to see scholars, students, from different backgrounds gathered here to reflect on an issue that is both intellectually rich and highly relevant to our contemporary world. It is a great honor for us to welcome our distinguished speaker, Professor Dr. Pal Nyiri, professor at Budapest University of Economic Budapest and Vrije Universiteit Amsterdam. Professor Nyiri is a leading scholar in the study of Chinese migrations, transnational mobility, and also China's global engagement. His publications has significantly shaped how we understand China not merely as a nation state, but as a complex social and cultural actor interacting with the world. We are truly grateful that he has agreed to share insights with us today. I would like to extend our appreciations to our moderator, Dr. Johannes Herlianto, for guiding today's discussions. With his academic expertise and experience, we are confident that the conversations will both stimulating and productive. Ladies and gentlemen, the theme of today's seminar introduces two intriguing terms, TAOJIN and TANGPING. I am new in this area, but I try to find information about it. For many outside the academic community of Chinese studies, this term may still sound unfamiliar, even puzzling. Yet, they capture important shifts in social attitudes, aspirations, and strategies among Chinese individuals and communities, both within China and beyond its borders. Taojin, literally meaning going out to seek fortune, reflects a long-standing ethos associated with migrations, mobility, and the pursuit of opportunity. It resonates strongly with earlier waves of Chinese migrations to Southeast Asia, where movement across border was often driven by economic necessity, social ambitions, and the hope for a better future. By contrast, Tangping or lying flat, in Indonesia we have similar term, rebahan, represents a more recent phenomenon. It signals withdrawal, disengagement, and a refusal to participate in what many perceive as an exhausting and unequal system of competitions. Rather than striving relentlessly for upward mobility, Tangping embodies a quiet form of resistance, one that challenges dominant narrative of success, productivity, and progress. Discussing Taojin and Tangping side by side invite us to ask deeper questions. What do these concepts tell us about changing values in Chinese society? How do they relate to migrations, mobility, and transnational connections? How do they reflect broader transformations in China's relationship with the global system? These questions are especially relevant today as we find ourselves amid ongoing global uncertainty marked by geopolitical tensions, economic reconfigurations, technological disruption, and shifting patterns of globalizations. China's reglobalizations is not simply about trade routes, infrastructure, or investment flows. It is also about people, ideas, aspirations, and anxieties moving across borders. For Southeast Asia, a region with deep historical and contemporary ties to China, these dynamics are particularly significant. Migrations, diaspora networks, cultural exchange, and communication flows continue to shape social and political realities across the region. Understanding the changing motivations and imaginaries behind Chinese mobility help us better grasp the evolving landscape of regional and global interactions. For those of us engaged in international relations, today's topic reminds us that global politics cannot be understood solely through states, institutions, and power balances. Everyday concepts like Taojing and Tangping reveal how individual choices and social sentiments intersect with larger structural forces such as globalizations, inequality, and shifting world orders. Meanwhile, for students and scholars of communications, this seminar highlights the importance of discourse, narrative, and meaning-making. These terms circulate through social media, popular cultures, and public debate, shaping how people interpret their place in the world. They demonstrate how language and communications become arenas where social tensions, aspirations, and resistance are expressed and negotiated. In this sense, today's seminar is not only about China or migrations, it is about how we understand global change from the ground up through lived experience, cultural expressions, and evolving forms of connectivity. Ladies and gentlemen, we hope that today's discussions will broaden our perspective, sharpen our analytical tools, and encourage further dialogue across disciplines. We also hope that this seminar serves as space for intellectual exchange, one that bridges Chinese studies, international relations, and communications in meaningful ways. Once again, I would like to thank Professor Dr. Paul Ngiri for joining us, Dr. Johannes Herlianto for moderating, both FSI and UPH, and participants who have made this event possible. Your presence today reflects a shared commitment to understanding the complexities of our globalized and re-globalizing world. Thank you very much, and I wish you all fruitful and engaging discussion. God bless us.
Thank you, Prof. Edwin. Could we give another round of applause for Prof. Edwin for giving his opening speech for today? And so next, I would like to invite Mr. Johannes Herlianto as the founder and chairman of Indonesian Sinology Forum to give a token of appreciation for Professor Edwin Tamunan. Next, I would like to invite Professor Palmiri to together, yes, let's take pictures together. Oh, foto bersama. Iya, pembicara. Okay, yeah, boleh. Next, maybe I will invite. Yeah, I will. Maybe the speakers and moderators can blend with the join the audience here. Okay, satu, one, two, three. Once again, one, two, three. Okay, thank you. Okay, next, allow me to introduce the moderator who will guide our discussions this morning. So he is the founder and the chairman of Indonesian Sinology Forum, and also has been a permanent lecturer in the master's program in communication studies, Graduate School of Pelita Harapan University since 2017. He earned the bachelor degree in Chinese studies and master degree in sociology, with both degree from the University of Indonesia. Later, he received doctorates in social and cultural anthropology from Macquarie University in Sydney and Vrije University in Amsterdam through co-tutel programs. He also was a lecturer in Chinese studies program at the University of Indonesia until 2013, and then taught in the Department of International Relations at Bina Nusantara University, Jakarta from 2013 to 2015. From 2016 to 2017, he conducted a research as a visiting fellow at the ISEAS Yusof Ishak Institute in Singapore, with his research interest focuses on ethnic Chinese in Indonesia, Indonesia-China relations, and images and perceptions of China and Chinese within the Indonesian society. Now, without further ado, let us warmly welcome Mr. Johannes Herlianto, PhD, and the floor is yours, sir.
Hello. Uh, Good morning. Let's do it. Thank you very much. Yeah, good morning for everyone, especially for Professor Palmieri. Welcome to Pelita Harapan University and welcome to Jakarta. Also, Pak Edwin, Ibu Nita, Ibu Nani, and everyone who has made the time to join this discussion. Welcome and thank you very much. Yeah, migration from China to many different places in the world, including Southeast Asia, is a phenomenon which is very interesting and important to study, especially for myself. For myself, I can, if I'm allowed to use myself as an example, it is interesting for me because it relates to my own history and even become the precursor of my existence in this world. As a person born to an ethnic Chinese mother, I am a product of such migration, actually. And I believe there are many more in these regions, not only in this country, who have, to a certain extent, related to this phenomenon. In fact, migrations from China have influenced and continued to influence many communities in many countries in Southeast Asia. Including today, when Southeast Asia, as well as other regions in the world, have become the host regions for the phenomenon known as the new migrants. How has this phenomenon been scholarly studied? How these studies of migrations position the Southeast Asian regions? Have the changes of time and age altered the characteristic of the above migrations and migrants? And how do we relate most recent waves of migrations to the effort made by China as a country to engage with the globalized capitalist system? I think these are the questions that really interest many people, and we are lucky today that we can get enlightening from one of the leading, and I think for me is the most renowned sinologist and migrations scholar in the world, Professor Palmieri. May I introduce again, if just now Stephanie said about my co-tutor PhD program, it was Professor Palmieri who actually enabled me to do that, made me possible to do that. Yes, Professor Nyiri is a professor at the Institute of Global Studies, Budapest University of Economic, but he's also the professor of global history from anthropological perspective at Vrije Universiteit, is that correct? Vrije Universiteit or VU Amsterdam. Professor Nyiri research focus on international mobility of China, middle class and Asian immigrations to Hungary and to Europe and to many different countries. Before becoming a professor in the VU, in 2009, studying from 2009, right, Professor Nyiri taught at the Macquarie University, Sydney, and before that, he was a fellow at Oxford University, and also you did research at NUS as well, right? But most importantly, Professor Nyiri studied Bahasa Indonesia in Manado in 1995. the some of the books are the most recent books are reporting on China, how Chinese correspondents work with the world, edited with the Daniel Tan, Chinese encounters in Southeast Asia, how people, money and ideas from China are changing a region. Without further ado, I actually give the time to Professor Nyeri. Thank you very much, bro.
So thank you very much, Johannes, and thank you, Professor Edwin. I'm very happy to be here. And I would like to thank the Sinology Forum and UPH for having me. It's a pleasure to see Johannes again here in Jakarta. This is actually my first time in Jakarta, although as Johannes mentioned, my first time in Indonesia was in 1995, but I never made it to Jakarta in these 31 years. Now, I am not a Southeast Asia scholar. I've done some research on Chinese migrations in Southeast Asia when I was teaching in Sydney. But as Johannes said, and actually, as Professor Edwin said earlier, what I'm interested in is how Chinese migration and the changes in the way that we see the changes in the destinations and the nature of Chinese migration in the past 30 years, more than 30 years that I've been studying it, how they reflect the changes in China's relationship with the world. So indeed, in order to understand how China relates to the world, as Professor Edwin said, we need to look at people as well as states. And conversely, when we look at the motives for migration and individual experiences, we need to see kind of the larger structures behind that. That's what I find very interesting throughout my research. And of course, during these 30-something years, we've seen a lot of changes. So this is what I would like to talk about today. Let's see. Can we get to the first slide, please? The following one? Yes. So this is before I begin. This is just a kind of personal anecdote. You see, this is not me. This is my grandfather. My grandfather, who had the same name as I, except his middle name, was a diplomat at the Hungarian embassy here in Jalan Cokroaminoto. I don't know where it is. I'm afraid we will not have the time to visit it. But he kind of preceded me here. This was in the early 1960s, so this was still under Sukarno. Okay, well, let me begin my talk, if I can open it. Yes. So Southeast Asia, I'm not sure how familiar you are with kind of scholarship on the Chinese presence in Southeast Asia, but you probably do know that Southeast Asia has always had a privileged place in the history of Chinese migrations, and therefore also in the scholarship on the history of Chinese migrations. But until the 1990s, except for, maybe there was a handful of studies on Chinese in North America or in Britain, but almost all studies on overseas Chinese until the 90s concerned Southeast Asia. And we actually talked about this a little bit with Hannah before the lecture. The Chinese societies in this region were seen as largely self-contained, to the point that when anthropologists wanted to study traditional Chinese social institutions in the first, well, let's say towards the middle of the 20th century, they, especially after 1949, when the Communist Party took over China, for the following 30 years, Southeast Asia was the place where they came to study Chinese society because they couldn't access China. And the Chinese societies in Southeast Asia served as a kind of proxy for what Chinese society was supposed to be like. And then in the post-reform era, so reform in China, 1978, in the post-reform era, migration from China to Southeast Asia followed the successive waves of China's entry into the global political economy. And so in this talk, I want to reflect a little bit on these waves and also how they have been reflected in scholarship. before doing that, I just want to say very briefly that scholarship on historical Chinese migrations has also changed, right? So it's when I started, dealing, and I think also when Johanna started studying with Bardahana, right? So at that time, the way that the Chinese migrations were seen by historians was very different, the way that they were studied. And this is because beginning in the 1990s, there was a turn towards interpreting migration history as not just migration history, but also a history of connections, both regionally and globally. Here I think the person who started this process was really Professor Anthony Reid, right, who in the 1980s began working on the history of the connections in the South China Sea, the connections in the Indonesian archipelago, and the role of migrations in those connections. And then later on, this was followed by a number of scholars like Leonard Andaya, Denis Lombard, James Francis Warren, and Eric Tagliacozzo, among others. So this is just an aside, really, because maybe there are some people here with an interest in history, but I'm not going to deal with that today. So after 1978, right, when Deng Xiaoping declared overseas relations to be a good thing, there was this famous saying, right, 海外关系是个好东西. And that was a very, very major change, right? Because before 1978, having relatives overseas was a very bad thing in China. It could subject you to political persecution. And Deng Xiaoping said that it was actually a good thing. So there was a revival of contacts between China and the settled Chinese populations in Southeast Asia. And it was these settled communities that attracted interest, rather than the renewed migration. There was actually also renewed migration, but nobody was paying much attention to this. And at first, this was limited to family reunification. Some of you probably are aware of the fact that after 1965, even before that, when many Indonesian-born Chinese went back to China, or maybe not back, they went to China, but after 1978, many of them took the opportunity to leave China again and settled in Hong Kong and recreated these family connections. Then in 1986, China reformed its passport system, and this was combined with an economic recession in China in the late 1980s, and there was a period of political uncertainty after the 1989 Tiananmen massacre. And in the early 90s, there was a restoration of diplomatic ties, right? I believe it was in 91, perhaps, or 1990? 1990, that China, the People's Republic, and Indonesia reestablished diplomatic relations. And so that triggered a new wave of migration from China to Southeast Asian countries. Can I have the, okay, we are already here, good. So here, this is an example. These are photos that I took myself. In Laos, these are two markets in northern Laos which were set up by Chinese traders. And of course, Indonesia at that time wasn't yet a target of Chinese migration. Mostly it was places, the neighboring countries, Laos, to some extent northern Thailand, which was the destination of these Chinese traders. And it took until about the mid-1990s that researchers started taking notice of these new trends. At the time, some of these first English language publications on this migration focused on the channel of illegal migration, because some of this migration was illegal, particularly from Fujian province, right? Some explored the kind of problematic relationship, particularly in Cambodia, between these Xinyimin, these new Chinese migrants, and the settled Chinese populations. This was, in the beginning, quite problematic because these settled Chinese in places like Cambodia still had fresh memories of how China during the Mao era supported armed movements that in many cases actually victimized local Chinese communities in Cambodia, but also to some extent in Burma. Now, So Southeast Asia, especially Burma and Thailand, also served as routes of illegal migration, what was called in Chinese as Toudu, from Fujian, especially northern Fujian, to the United States and Japan. But of course, the vast majority of migration to Southeast Asia in the 90s consisted of this kind of small traders who were taking advantage of newly opening markets for consumer goods in these formerly planned economies of Laos, Cambodia, and Burma, and also Thailand. And these migrants increasingly came from poorer inland areas of China with no traditions of migration, like, for instance, the city of Shaodong in Hunan, rather than the coastal regions that had sent migrants to many countries a century earlier, like Fujian and Guangdong. And this new entrepreneurial migration fit into a broader pattern of, what might be called the global neoliberal transformation of the economy, and into a trend of relative economic deregulation and state-encouraged entrepreneurship in China. Because at that time, so we're talking about the 90s, opening a small business, which in Chinese was known as xiahai, jumping into the sea. So this was the most popular path of upward mobility. At that time, it was common for academics to quit, or even government officials to quit their jobs and instead become traders in markets. I had a fellow graduate student at that time in the United States whose father had been a professor of physics at the university, and he complained that this professor earned less money than the shoemaker who was sitting at the entrance to the university. So this was one and the major form of migration at the time, but it emerged in parallel to another, more limited and state-organized form of migration, which was the sending of contract labor. So in Mandarin, this was known as Lao Wu Shu Chu. But in Southeast Asia, this was not particularly visible. Maybe the only place where you began seeing these Chinese contract workers was Singapore in the 1990s. And then the third parallel migration pathway was educational migration, in other words, students, right? So beginning in the late 70s, early 80s, students started coming out of China. But again, this was, in Southeast Asia, this wasn't a very significant wave, except perhaps in Singapore. It's worth noting, though, that by the early 2000s, this educational migration was expanding to high school students, to secondary school students who were accompanied by their mothers. Again, this is at the time was mostly Singapore, a few other places, maybe a little bit Malaysia, but that came later. So what I want to propose is that these migrations were linked to the first wave of China's reglobalization. Why do I call it reglobalization? Because of course China was very global until the 20th century. And certainly until the 19th century, there is a lot of scholarship that shows the significance of China in global trade going back to the 16th century. So I think we need to remember that this is a return rather than a completely new phenomenon. So China's return to the global economy started with this kind of Chinese manufactured consumer goods, cheap things. And then later it continued with the entry of global corporations, which would be the next slide, if I can have it, please. Thank you. And the emergence of contract manufacturing for a global market. This process, this first stage of China's reglobalization, gave rise to a small layer of nouveau riche, of the newly rich in China, and a rather limited middle class, which particularly these newly wealthy individuals felt compelled and could afford to send their children abroad. But the hallmark migrant figure of that period in the 1990s that kind of captured the imagination of the Chinese and was the subject of actually a lot of TV dramas was the figure of the small trader, the pioneer kind of adventurer. This was the TAOJIN, the gold digger, who abandoned the familiar environment and went out into the world for TAOJIN, for prospecting for gold. So this was at that time a kind of very popular figure in the Chinese imagination. And then if we move to the kind of forward by 10 years, the 2000s, 2010s, then we enter an era when Chinese companies, large Chinese companies, began building an overseas presence, starting with the construction and power generation, mining industries, and then later expanding into manufacturing, agriculture, and telecommunications infrastructure. And this, unlike the previous wave, this really affected the whole of Southeast Asia. Of course, the scale of such companies varied greatly, from small-scale private mines, plantations, and apparel factories in places like Laos and Cambodia and Burma, to the state-owned or quasi-state-owned giants such as the State Grid, which is China's electricity generation company, which made major investments in the Philippines, or Sino-Hydro, the hydropower company, which is present, I think, in many countries in Southeast Asia, or China Railway Construction Corporation, which is present in Indonesia, and of course Huawei, which everyone knows. So this was, again, across the region. What these phenomena or these companies have in common is that, unlike the first wave of individual migrant entrepreneurs, these companies brought with them a varied core of workers from China, which included senior intra-company transferees, so managers, senior managers, junior managers and technicians who were hired for this overseas expansion, as well as laborers, workers who were recruited and employed by subcontractors. So, these were typically not direct employees of the company, but they were supplied by labor recruiters from inland areas like Sichuan. And in addition, these companies, like other major companies, required the services of a range of specialized suppliers, like law firms, accounting firms, and other suppliers that were both Chinese and brought from China and international. And these subcontractors, in turn, again, transferred or recruited staff from China. The 2008 financial crisis accelerated this process, right? If you recall, because Chinese companies were able to acquire assets from distressed businesses at a discount, particularly distressed Western businesses, but also Southeast Asian businesses. And so in the 2010s, this range of companies expanded further as Chinese brands, from consumer electronics and household appliances to vehicles and surveillance equipment makers, which had already been present in Southeast Asian markets via local retailers, but now they began building a more structured international presence that was aimed at constructing a brand reputation, right? And this brought with them, again, a new type of infrastructure, because now these companies were dealing directly with Southeast Asian consumers. Whereas in the past, in the earlier phase or the earlier stage of this phase, they were suppliers to the state or to businesses. But now they started dealing directly with Southeast Asian consumers, and they had to move into the cities, and so they required on-the-ground sales forces, marketing forces, service forces, which meant that they had to bring with them a different cohort of Chinese workers. But actually the consequences of the expansion of Chinese companies for migration and the complexity of interactions between these different groups of migrants is still a topic that hasn't been very much explored by researchers. I think it would be very worthwhile looking into. During this period, the expansion, of course, we were, from 2000 until roughly 2020 or maybe 2015, something like this, the first 15 years of the 21st century, I think, were the period of the largest growth of the Chinese middle class. So incomes grew enormously, and this had consequences for migration, because more families could afford to send their children to study abroad, while, at the same time, competition for university places in China increased. So educational migration, both at the secondary and tertiary level, expanded. Principal is still to Singapore, but now also more to Malaysia. To a lesser degree to Thailand and the Philippines. And in addition, this was also, as you know, the time of a rapid rise in Chinese tourism to Southeast Asia, which was facilitated by cheaper flights and fewer entry barriers, right? Visa-free agreements in the period preceding the coronavirus pandemic. And so a new variety of short-term migration emerged that was catering to the needs of middle-class Chinese clients on whose behalf traders were buying and dispatching luxury goods and specialty goods from Southeast Asian countries, known in China as daiko, so buying on behalf of others. Other entrepreneurs moved from China to Southeast Asia to cater to Chinese tourists, and of course the most notorious phenomenon that arose in this period was the rise of casino hubs, catering to gamblers from China in places like Burma, Laos, Cambodia, and the Philippines, which attracted, these were also significant employment hubs. They attracted thousands of migrant entrepreneurs and workers. But this is, while the most notorious instance, it's only a specific instance of this general trend of creating a market for Chinese tourists, consumers in China who wished to visit these Southeast Asian countries and therefore needed services and goods. And then related to that, but of a different nature, is the expansion, again a very, very particular phenomenon that you are probably familiar with, is this notorious expansion of online fraud hubs in Cambodia and Burma and the Philippines, which typically employs Chinese workers recruited via false advertising and then coerced into online scams. That is also a form of migration, and it is also related to the rise of wealth in China. So, this is roughly, these various forms of migration and international mobility are linked to what I see as the second wave of China's reglobalization. And now, I'd like to move to the third wave. So if we can get to the next slide, please. This is something that you began seeing in the 2010s, but it particularly accelerated after the coronavirus pandemic in the 2020s. So the migration flows I've been discussing before, they were entrepreneurial migrations, labor migrations, and educational migrations, which fundamentally replicate, they repeat pre-modern and colonial era patterns, right? In the sense that they're ultimately aimed at capital accumulation. Whether it's even educational migration in its classical form is eventually aimed at improving economic opportunities. And they had all been tied to, and they also harnessed the shift of the core of global capitalist production to China, right? So this is a process that began in the 1980s and then plateaued and began to decline in the 2010s. But at the same time, changes in educational migration already indicated the emergence of a different logic. And that logic had, I think, no precedent in the history of Chinese migrations, which is a logic that is not related to production in the sense of economic accumulation, but to social reproduction. What do I mean? So if you look at Chinese parents who move with their children to Chiang Mai in northern Thailand or to Penang in Malaysia, what they seek is not only or not primarily to enhance their children's competitiveness in the global job market, but also to create a family life that is more relaxed, healthier, and carries fewer pressures, allows more leisure, and more accessible extracurricular amenities. And that is part of a broader trend, I would like to argue. So, when residential real estate developers started developing seaside resorts and city condominiums specifically with the Chinese market in their minds, and I think this began with Thailand and the Philippines, but was also present, is present in Malaysia and Cambodia, and of course Singapore. I'm not sure to what extent there is something like this in Indonesia. But so when this was started, then of course this was primarily aimed at Chinese investors, right? To soak up the surplus money, the surplus wealth of the middle class, which was looking for ways to invest outside China. But nonetheless, it was these investments were frequently linked to plans for tourism, for study-related migration, for retirement, and for lifestyle migration, meaning that people were also looking at more relaxed environments in which to spend either their retired years or maybe part of their lives even during their active period. So changes in Chinese society meant that many Chinese people became more affluent. They were leading now quite comfortable lives at home. And this also meant that unlike in the 1990s, they were less motivated or less inclined to venture out for economic opportunities with uncertain outcomes. In contrast, the 2010s and especially the 2020s have seen a rise in what we call lifestyle migrations of younger people who were looking for adventure or for more leisurely lifestyles for themselves and for their children. Beginning in the 1990s, as I mentioned earlier, there was a small number of wealthy entrepreneurs and officials who had sought to gain a foothold abroad for their families and their children in case of political problems in China or economic problems in China, right? So this was more as a kind of safety option. And this trend intensified since the crackdown on tech enterprises in China in 2022 under Xi Jinping, where wealthy individuals, particularly very wealthy individuals, feel once again increasingly insecure. They don't know what might happen in the future. And so that is the reason why they've been creating these so-called family offices in Singapore to kind of move their wealth to the extent allowed possible and their families abroad. But then in addition to these very wealthy individuals, after the 2008 financial crisis and against the background of rising incomes and rising real estate prices in China, the middle class also became, it became possible for the middle class to invest abroad and to buy real estate and to create this kind of migration plans. And then from the late 2010s, there were a number of processes, still ongoing processes in China that accelerated these trends, such as rising unemployment amongst university graduates, declining upward mobility, meaning that it's harder and harder for somebody not born into a privileged position to succeed in Chinese society, unlike in the 1990s. And there is this pervasive sense of what in China is known as social involution. In China, they use the term 内卷. Yes, exactly. Which is to say that in order to preserve your middle class status, you need to invest more and more time and more money just to stay in the same place. Interestingly, this word involution actually was first invented in relation to Indonesia, to Javanese agriculture, Javanese peasants who had to invest more and more energy to just maintain their yields. And then this was invented by the famous anthropologist Clifford Geertz, and it was picked up by a Chinese anthropologist and became a very popular term in Chinese society. So this 内卷 and as well as tightening political controls, which of course the middle class at one point no longer found so pleasant, right? I mean, they wanted to have some kind of degree of political freedom, even if they were not opposed to the government, but they resented the fact that they had to study, Xi Jinping every day and so on. So that created one response, which was TANGPIng. TANGPIng, this, what do you say, rebahan? Yes. And one way this rebahan manifested itself in China is that some middle-class families decided to move away from the big coastal cities, the coastal metropolises, to smaller inland cities like Dali in Yunnan, which were known for more pleasant environment and for less social pressure. But others chose to emigrate. Others chose to leave China altogether. And for many of these people, it was especially what they experienced during the coronavirus pandemic that prompted them to really want to leave China. I'm not sure how visible this is from Indonesia, but for middle-class Chinese society, what they experienced during the lockdowns in Shanghai, Wuhan, and other places, it was really a shock. So people who had relatively privileged lifestyles suddenly realized that from one moment to the next, the government might decide to cut them off. They could no longer go out of their houses. Sometimes domestic pets were taken away and killed because they were considered a health risk. So this degree of sudden state intervention was something that came as a shock to this generation and this class. So at that point, they started looking for lower cost destinations to leave. And this included places like Chiang Mai in northern Thailand, or Malaysia, which has this Malaysia My Second Home scheme. Looking for things like a smooth immigration process, comfortable lives, but also English language or international schooling. So this has become an increasingly important phenomenon among middle-class migrants, right? This is the two lower images, of course, you can see what they are, that's clear. Maybe I need to explain the image on the top. This Nowhere bookstore is an independent Chinese bookstore in Chiang Mai. So Chiang Mai is interesting because it has attracted a lot of lifestyle migrants, a lot of middle-class parents whose children now go to school there, but also some people who are kind of political dissidents. And so they set up this independent bookstore, which has become a hub of social and intellectual events. And so I think I want to end on this by pointing out that this really is a part of a global shift in the political economy of Chinese migration, because what we're seeing here is something that I think has little historical precedent. And perhaps I could just add to this that these places like Chiang Mai, they also generate new forms of transnational political engagement. So now these young Chinese who, to some degree resent being controlled and they want to have some degree of intellectual freedom, they designate themselves as the diasporic Chinese. This was, now they use in Chinese the term lisan, which literally means diaspora, but which had never been used before by the Chinese overseas for themselves, right? I mean, they call themselves Huaqiao or Huayi or Huayan, but this lisan term, this lisan, li kai de li, 然后散家的散, that's a literal translation of the Greek word diaspora. So, like this. And so now they use this term for themselves. Maybe one last comment that I want to make is that there is also a very particular phenomenon that we haven't seen since the 1990s, which is illegal immigration, right? I mean, in the 1990s, there was a big wave of tōdu, mostly targeting Japan, North America, United States, and Europe. Then, when Chinese society became wealthier in the 2000s, people just stopped doing this. It was no longer worthwhile paying so much and risking so much in order to get out and maybe finding a job somewhere. But now, in the 2020s, you've started seeing tōdu again. Of course, the most famous of this case is what's called 走线 in North America. So Chinese people traveling to Ecuador, and from Ecuador to Panama, and then walking through this famous Darien Gap to reach the United States, which has been shut down by Trump. But before that happened, there was actually a large number of Chinese crossing illegally from Mexico to the United States. And interestingly, there's been some cases of TAOJIN in Indonesia. I don't know how well known this was, or whether the Indonesian press reported on this, but there were cases of people taking boats from Indonesian islands to Australia, Chinese people, right? And this is something we haven't seen since the 1990s. So this is indicative of some kind of important shift in Chinese society to do with, of course, the economic problems, but also with the kind of political repression. So I think I would like to end here, and maybe we can have some discussion.
Well, Professor Nyeri. So TAOJIN, how do you spell it? How do you call it? Okay. Okay, TAOJIN. Right, yeah. Right. Thank you very much, Professor Nyeri. It is very interesting, enlightening, and I liked, that this kind of waves and how each waves has been related to the states, the internal dynamic in the states effort. Hello, yeah, the internal dynamics in the state and its effort to globalizations, right? So can I now invite any questions from the floor? Start with three first questions. Yeah. Isyana, any other questions? Yeah, sorry? Nazis, yeah, Mas Nazis. Oh, yeah, Mas Iksan, okay. Please, Isyana, first.
Okay. Yeah. I think I need to stand up. Okay, so good morning, Professor Nyeri. My name is Isyana. I'm from President University. I have one question. So it's really interesting how the 2020s following COVID has seen a flow of migration of Chinese to Southeast Asia, and how the wealthy Chinese have moved to Singapore, and then they also have moved to Malaysia, so much so that these two countries actually have started to accommodate them with the Malaysia Home Program, and then reports about the wealthy Chinese setting up family offices in those countries. And actually, I don't know if you are aware, but there has been a similar phenomenon in Indonesia. Recently, I mean, beginning in 2025, I think it probably started like a year before, in 2024, there was this famous hashtag called Kabur Aja Dulu, right? So I mean, like young Indonesians wanting to leave Indonesia to set up a better life overseas. So much so that this phenomenon from Indonesia gained worldwide attention, and then the Japanese government actually sent representatives to make videos briefing Indonesia about what they needed to prepare should they become interested in moving to Japan, to work. And my question is, do you see Indonesians moving overseas for a better life following the same or similar trajectory to their Chinese counterparts? Thank you very much.
Hi, Professor Nyeri. My name is Aziz. I'm currently working as a journalist at Xinhua News Agency at Jakarta office, and I covered a lot about Indonesia and China partnerships, including Indonesian nationals with Chinese descent. And after working, I realized that I will jump into the question. So on your presentation, you mentioned that there is a term for those who identify themselves as Chinese diaspora, especially in recent years. And do you think that it is part of the social reasons? Like, if I identify myself as a Chinese diaspora who was living in overseas, it can help to lift up my social status in my home country? Like, if I live overseas, live up my social status. Like it means like that I have privilege. I am wealthier than those who are still living in China. So is there any such kind of reasons that motivate them to move abroad? And the second question is related to, you've mentioned a long history of different wave of migration from the past to the most recent. And why has Southeast Asian countries, including like Malaysia, Indonesia, Singapore, Thailand, has become popular destination for Chinese for years, for decades perhaps, to move abroad? Like why Southeast Asia became the popular destination for them to move abroad rather than going to like Central Asian country, which is as well next to them. So yeah, that's my question.
Work? Yes. So thank you. These are both very interesting questions. What was the term you mentioned? Kaburnya dulu? Kabur. What does kabur mean?
Runaway.
Oh, very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. Oh, yes, okay, get it. Right. So, yeah, this is interesting because in China they use the term run. Have you heard this? So, yeah, 润学. So, 润, which in Chinese means something like to grease, to oil, or sometimes to make money, right? But it's a pun on the English word run, which is spelled in the same way in Pinyin. So that's also running away. And that's actually a really good question. I've been thinking about this, whether, I don't think this is limited to China. I think as the middle classes outside the West become larger, this is probably a kind of general phenomenon. And in Russia, you see that as well. I mean, people who, middle-class people who have enough money, but who are unhappy with either the political or the social systems, they find there's too much pressure, this is not the place where they want to raise children. They move to environments which they find more pleasant. And these environments don't have to be necessarily the more developed economically, they just have to be more pleasant. So, so I'm very curious about this Indonesian phenomenon, and I mean, I think also India, yeah, I'm very curious. But you're saying that this is also this is not just for lifestyle, but also simply for work, right? Yeah. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
You know, downgrade. They might downgrade from middle class or even middle upper class, you know, to like middle lower class,
Yeah.
because the possibility of them getting blue collar jobs overseas is always there.
Mm-hmm.
So much so that you know, there have been again, I don't know the exact number, but there have been quite a lot of reports about young people being scammed, you know, following fake vacancies, you know, from Laos, Cambodia, even Thailand, you know, because they are so dying to move overseas, you know, to set up a better life.
That's, yeah. I mean, I think we need to think more about this because this seems like a combination of different motives. So it seems in some ways perhaps similar to what happened in China in the 90s, but in other ways it's also different. Because I think people's imagination of what these new lives might look like, they have shifted in part under the influence of social media, you know, the way the differences in the way that people communicate or form their impressions of the world. But I think that's actually really interesting and should be researched. Now, to the next question, why Southeast Asia rather than Central Asia, right? Oh no, you had the first question was when social status of the diaspora. So I think it was more in the 90s that moving abroad raised your social status, and maybe even earlier. Now I would say that's not really the case anymore. In fact, in some cases it's the opposite. Because on the one hand, All right. I mean, China has some troubles with the economy, but it's still seen as I mean, because everywhere there are economic problems, right? So it's definitely not perceived that moving abroad will raise your economic status necessarily. Some people who move abroad find that their classmates in China are doing much better than they. And in terms of social status, it's no longer the case that by getting a degree abroad you make it easier to improve your social status in China. Probably not. If you really want to succeed in China, you need to get into one of the top Chinese universities. That's much more useful than studying abroad in a kind of average university. Plus, because now once again this 海外关系, this overseas relations, has become a risky thing. I don't know if you've heard the latest, you probably are aware of this fact that there is this regulations regarding so-called 裸官, the naked officials, they are called, officials whose families live abroad, which for a while was tolerated. But now, this year, they've really been told you either have to get your families back to China or you have to resign. And this is something that is happening. I mean, overseas association is now not necessarily a good thing, it can be a risk. And then your second question is why Southeast Asia rather than Central Asia? Well, of course, this goes back, a long way in history. Maritime connections were always much more developed than overland connections. It was much easier to travel by sea than to travel overland. And Southeast Asian societies were much more populous. They were settled societies, they were richer. So therefore, of course, trade was mostly with Southeast Asia. With Central Asia, there was some trade, but much less. They were sparsely populated, nomadic peoples, and so on. Of course, there were also some oases, but overall, there was much more to do with Southeast Asia. And the first connections were trade connections. And then, to some extent, the geography is still very important. Why people nowadays move to Southeast Asia? Well, for a variety of reasons. It's to do sometimes with education, sometimes with lifestyle, and sometimes with economic opportunities, which, but in part this is still shaped by geography. I mean, geographic proximity still matters, whereas Central Asian, there are some people who move to Central Asia, but definitely much less popular. Oh, we can take the next question. I think there was the, yeah.
Hi, Professor Nyiri. My name is Iksan. I'm from Forum Sinologi and also Paramadina. So I was graduate from Taiwan. So one of my professors said that there are a lot of FDI come to Hungary, right, from China, which is I've never been there. So I just listened to his explanation. But I'm interested in so if we look at the typical of the foreign direct investment from China, is they not only bring money and also technology, but also people, right? Which is highly related with the migrants issues, with the illegal migrants, which in Indonesia always happen during the election year, because that the really discussion, the debate is really related to the political opposition, things like that. I'm wondering about I'm thinking to depart from the Southeast Asia if it is possible to go to the Europe. How the European, which is have a lot of FDI, dealing with this kind of possible legal immigrants which is come from the FDI. Sort of like what happened in my studies is about nickel in Sulawesi. So there are a lot of illegal, because it's geographically very difficult to doing evaluation, monitoring. So there are a lot of Chinese, influx of there, illegal mostly, which is, and Indonesian state is really weak, right, in terms of imposing rules and stuff like that, and you can bribe easily, right? So that's kind of reason. So I'm thinking about how the European countries, which also get a lot of FDI from Chinese, how they deal with the workers, especially the illegal workers. Thank you.
Oh, can I? Yes. Siapa nih? Udah nih. Aku kalau masih ada waktu aja.
Hi, my name is Nani Stiadi. I'm the lecturer of the communication science, and I teach media and cultural studies. The theme from TAOJIN to TANGPING is very interesting to me, especially when you're talking about the Southeast Asia migration. To my knowledge, it's like a shift from actively chasing success and to deliberately opting out and choosing low pressure life. This is very interesting. Yeah, it means that before you are looking for success and by having capital, of course, and now shifting to that modest living, and by then it's redefined, quote unquote, the term of success. Okay, my question to you, because you're talking about the Southeast Asia Chinese migration, especially in the Southeast Asia, where is the quote unquote most favorite place for all those migration, especially by the youth? Is it, your example is Singapore, maybe Thailand or Bangkok? I'm not sure if Indonesia is one of the options. It is because it's a very shifting, values for urban China. And I just want to ask you, which is a favorite place or capital in Southeast Asia? And because it is interesting for me, especially when I teach media, because the discourse of success, which is constructed in social media, might be the motive to move. Is it because of the housing cost that might be the reason for that, or whatever? As you know, in mainland China, is it particularly migrating from the mainland China to, or in between the Chinese diaspora in Southeast Asia? Thank you.
Is it? Yes. So thank you for these questions. Regarding the FDI and the related flow of workers, actually I'm curious what is the illegal aspect that you are talking about in Indonesia's case? In Europe, because of the FDI was, I guess in Indonesia this is mostly mining, isn't it? In Sulawesi you're talking about. So in Europe, of course, the FDI is typically in manufacturing, right, rather than extraction, which means that the Chinese workers are usually present, mostly they're present in the construction phase, right, which is temporary. But actually, there is not that much experience yet, because in Hungary now, I can tell you from my own research that in Hungary there are these very large constructions currently going on, similar to Indonesia in a way. There's the railway, the Budapest-Belgrade Railway. There are electric vehicle battery factories, which I think are also happening in Indonesia, right? Very large investments. And here what you are seeing is, yes, there is a presence of Chinese workers, but it is, well, the companies say this is temporary. And as far as I understand, this is not illegal, although I would say it's a kind of rather lax application. I mean, if the state wanted to control this more closely, they could. They could say it's similar to what Trump has done, right, with the Koreans, where he said, you are not here on this kind of visa. What are you doing here? You should not be working. Go back, right? So if the Hungarian state wanted to do this, they could apply visa categories more strictly, because these workers are there usually on short-term business visas. Whether they are supposed to be, actually engaging in construction work with that kind of visas is unclear. It's a matter of how you interpret them. But obviously, the Hungarian state is not. It doesn't have the political will to kind of counter this and say you have to employ local workers, because finding local workers for this kind of jobs would be difficult. And maybe that's different in Indonesia. Maybe in Indonesia it's the case of Chinese companies preferring to work with Chinese workers rather than not finding locals. But in Hungary, it would be difficult to find local workers. In fact, there was one case in Serbia where there was some kind of, it was one of the very few cases where there was a conflict around workers, but those workers were not Chinese. They were Vietnamese workers who were recruited to work at a Chinese-owned tire factory, but the recruitment was actually not done by a Chinese company. It was done by a local subcontractor. So this is very interesting because it points to yet another issue, which is that this expansion of China's reglobalization, it doesn't only generate Chinese migration flows, it also generates migration flows from other countries to other countries. And in that regard, of course, Vietnam is one of the major exporters now of workers. So is Burma, and maybe some others. I think what we will see in the future is that more of these Chinese projects globally will try to find way to employ non-Chinese labor, but that labor may not be local either. It may come from countries neighboring China. Okay, and then regarding the, what are the favorite destinations in Southeast Asia? Well, I think Singapore is one of them. But of course, we also need to realize that, although I was speaking in a general way, there are distinct, different people migrate for different reasons still. So Singapore continues to be the preferred place for the wealthy because they see it as a relatively safe place, considering that Singapore has good relations with the Chinese state, but not so close that they might be. That they might feel a direct risk if the Chinese state decides to clamp down on them. Of course, they are not completely protected, that's clear, but I think the trade-off of relatively easy communications, relatively easy economic transfers, and relative safety is probably, plus of course a Chinese-speaking environment. Of course, that combination for this particular group of people remains very attractive. And of course, Singapore remains the preferred educational destination in Southeast Asia. But for more lifestyle, families seeking a more pleasant lifestyle destination, I think it is principally, as I said, not even Bangkok, but Chiang Mai in northern Thailand, which is within a very easy reach from China, and probably Malaysia. I think those two. I would be very interested in learning whether something like this is happening in Indonesia as well, but I haven't come across this. So maybe you can tell me. Yeah.
This can be further research
for sure. Yes, definitely.
And Professor Yuris. Yeah. So, any other question? Yeah, Hannah first, and there's anyone after that? Hannah, you can actually ask your question. Okay.
Hi, Professor Pal. I'm not actually sure how to pronounce your name. Pal? Paul? Pal. Okay, Pal. So thank you so much for speaking for us today. It's been such a great time. I've enjoyed your presentation. So we've been talking about Chinese migrants, whether it be back in the 1990s or back ages ago, before, you know, the ones who created us Chinese Indonesians, yes? And now we're speaking about Chinese migrants today. Now, there is something that I have observed based off of my own interactions with some Chinese migrants that I personally know and am friends with and am close with. And it is that one thing that I've noticed that contrasts with your observation of Chinese migrants is that they move to, so what you say is that they move to certain Southeast Asian countries in order to get a better life. Now, what I assume from that is that they do not wish to return to China. Am I right? Is that what you're saying?
Well, I think that varies. I think, yeah. There are very different modalities, right, of even people who choose to go abroad for lifestyle reasons. Some of them continue getting an income in China from business ventures or even kind of teleworking. They're like digital nomads. Some of them split their families where the family stays abroad, and typically it's the husband that keeps going back to China. Some of them actually spend all of their time outside China, but I don't think they say, I never want to return to China again.
Right.
This is open-ended. Like actually in most migrations, I think there are very few migrants who leave with the intention of never to return again, right? People just don't know what will happen in their lives later on.
Right, yes, that's true. There's the, I would say, psychological aspect to that. But, so there is a phenomenon which I would say I've observed of Korean migrants coming to Indonesia and eventually settling down here. So we call them the Korean Indonesians. And what they have been doing is they have been coming here either sent by their companies, so say Hyundai, Samsung, so on and so forth, and they eventually choose to settle down here, marry somebody who's local, and just stay here as somebody who's wealthier, has more power, has more PPP in Indonesia than they would in Korea. Now, the thing is that a lot of the Chinese migrants that I interact with are people who have expressed a very hard stance that they would not stay here, that they would not, settle down here, that they would go back to China if they had the chance once they're done with whatever they are here to do. So what my question is why is there such a difference between those two, despite their economies being rather similar?
Well, first of all, I think it's very interesting what you said about the Koreans, and again, that goes back to sort of my sense that this phenomenon is not limited to China, but it's to do with this kind of rise of the middle classes around the world outside the West. And in fact, I would say that there are people like those that you describe. There are Chinese people like those that you describe. It's not just Hyundai and Samsung, but also Huawei and some of these other companies. You see similar things. People who have been sent by those companies abroad, but then they feel less work pressure, they feel like they, for the same income, they can have more fulfilling lives in those places, and they decide to remain. So it does exist also within the Chinese environment. Now, the particular group that you were talking about, who say they want to return to China, I would like to know more about who they are in order to be able to reply to your question. Who are they? What kind of, why are they here?
So they're mostly either students or they are workers indeed, so sent by their companies. But the ones that I have specifically spoken to are indeed students, and they don't plan on staying here in Indonesia.
Yeah, well, I mean, you know, there is a variety of experiences and aspirations, and of course, I think you would be in a much better position to tell me why they want to return and not stay. But of course, that also happens. I mean, if you are interested in, if you are a student, let's say, and you don't come from a particularly wealthy background, and you try to build up some sort of career, it might be a reasonable choice on your side to return to the country where you have connections to do so. But it depends on a lot of things. It depends on your family background, on your educational credentials. It can, of course, also be just a result of not feeling, not feeling at home. There are different options. I mean, the people who decide to settle locally are usually those who already have some kind of level of income or capital to lead a middle class, fairly comfortable life. But I mean, I would be curious about the motivations of those particular people. Maybe you can tell me later about them.
No? Okay. Now, then Mas Aziz, and then go back to Isyana. Yes.
It's still related to the previous question. So is there any reasons like Chinese migrants, they are more nationalistic compared to Korean migrants, so that Korean are more likely to stay here than those Chinese? Is there any like nationalism behind those phenomenon?
Well, yes. I mean, in order to answer that question, I would need to, to know the phenomenon, to know the individuals. But I can say, in general, the fact that people want to return is not necessarily linked to nationalism. You can be a diehard nationalist and not return to your country. That's in fact quite common. In some sense, it's easier to be a nationalist from a distance. In the case of Chinese abroad, well, I think that's an interesting question, how nationalism among Chinese overseas, and particularly these new waves of migrants, how that has developed. Of course, there is a lot of Chinese nationalism, both among new migrants and among established overseas Chinese populations. But what I see as something very interesting, so in 2008, that was the year of the Peking Olympics, as you perhaps remember, some of my students, not Johannes, but other students and me did some research in Sydney. I was then teaching in Australia. That was asking why so many Chinese students turned out at demonstrations supporting the Chinese government and opposing Western media. So there was this really very, very visible wave of Chinese nationalism among young people studying abroad. Compared to that, I actually feel, I mean, I haven't done any study on this, so this is not a well-founded conclusion, but I have the feeling that this nationalist sentiment among students abroad has actually declined. That is more polarized. There are probably some who still are quite nationalistic, but there are also an increasing number of people who are quite critical of the Chinese government, and they might still be, they might still feel a close attachment to China, the country, but no longer the loyalty to the Chinese government in the same way. It's quite common to encounter students like that in Europe. There might be some difference in Southeast Asia, but I'm not sure. It's again a very interesting question which needs research.
Okay, thank you very much for giving me another opportunity. My name is Ishana from President University, and I have no follow-up question to my initial question, but more about like a response to your statement about Singapore being a favorite for wealthy Chinese. And so it did remind me of when Malaysia and Singapore just separated back in 1965, and then Lee Kuan Yew, as Prime Minister at the time, often said to the media that he was keen to differentiate Singapore from China, as in like he didn't want people to think of Singapore as another China, and it went on, throughout his administration. And now that wealthy Chinese have made Singapore a favorite, and there are, a flow of Chinese migrants to Singapore that set up family offices, has the perspective of Singaporeans to Chinese, especially the Chinese migrants, changed at all? Because I read somewhere a few years ago that there was a few years ago that there was a negative perspective towards Chinese migrants. Those who migrated to Singapore as students, those who moved to Singapore as small traders. There was a negative perspective towards them. But now that it's the wealthy Chinese that moved to Singapore and have actually made it their favorite, has there been a change in the perspective? Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's another interesting question. And I have to say that I haven't read any recent studies on that particular group. But my guess would be, based on previous research, my guess would be that these tensions remain, right? Because that there still is a tension between, Chinese Singaporeans, what they call China Chinese, and of course the non-Chinese Singaporeans, right? And these tensions have to do probably with a number of things. One is real estate prices, which are driven up by these new immigrants. And in that case, it doesn't matter so much that they are Chinese. The fact, it's just that they drive up the prices. By the way, the same thing is happening in Japan. In Japan, there was a big backlash against this upper and middle class Chinese who benefited from some kind of fairly easy visa policy until 2025, until August last year, and they were buying up real estate in Osaka and places like this. So partly it's a backlash that's not really ethnic, but it's not based on that. Partly I think there is still a mutual distrust where the Chinese people from China see Singapore Chinese as inauthentic, kind of not speaking proper Chinese, etc., whereas the Singapore Chinese see themselves as more cosmopolitan, worldly, whatever. So I think that tension probably also remains. But again, it would be interesting to see some new research. It's very new. There is some research on these family offices, I think by people like Brenda Yo and others, and they had also written about perceptions of Chinese immigrants among Singaporeans earlier, but not this particular question yet.
Thank you. Yes, I think I also heard something about this. That I just talked with some.
The microphone working?
Yeah. Yes. Does it work now? Yeah, I actually heard. I just had a discussion with some Singaporean friends, and they told me that the younger generations of the mainland Chinese migrants in Singapore actually don't really speak Chinese like their mothers anymore. They choose to speak English. Have you heard about it? And yes. Yeah.
No, I haven't heard about this, but I imagine, because of course we haven't spoken about another group, right? There is also a fairly large group of skilled immigrants in Singapore, who are not neither the Chinese workers nor these ultra wealthy, but they are recruited by tech companies or by sometimes they're former graduates, and if their children maybe like
yes,
they might
go to the Singapore local schools.
Yeah, right.
Yes.
Sure. Yeah.
All right. Any other questions from the floor? If not, can I ask one question? It's the last question, hopefully, for this session. Then how do you think, again, like the tensions, the impact of the coming of these migrations to the societies? In Indonesia, actually, there are a lot of tension actually between the local Indonesians with the migrants, but from the foreign forms, like those who come with become the laborers, to work with the companies, etc. But until now, I don't see any problem with those who come here for relax, right? For this for the TANGPING group, right? But what about what do you think in other Southeast Asian countries? The impact, is there any impact? Do Southeast Asian governments should worry about the coming of these migrants, or will they actually create a problem, or instead they will actually benefit the host countries? Thank you.
Yeah, again, this is a very good question, and it's I can't answer because I don't think there is any research. This is all too new. But my sense is that among this TANGPING group, probably until now, there has been probably very little tension, because this is still not large enough, right? It could become a problem if it reaches the scale that it has had in Japan, where I mean, I actually have a book here with me which is called Running to Japan. It's by a Chinese journalist, actually used to work for, by a Japanese journalist who actually was based in Singapore for a long time. He worked for this Chinese outlet called TAOJIN, which is a very, very well-known economic portal. And I've just started reading this book, but so if you look at this group of people from the inside, then what you see is that these are people who largely left China because they wanted more political freedom. They felt too constrained by political and social regulations. But from the perspective of Japanese society, what they see is a group of rich Chinese who are buying up real estate. So the response from Japanese society was not really supportive. They were not saying, oh, there are these Chinese who don't hate Japan. On the contrary, they like Japan, they come here. And in fact, the recent rise of this, what is called Shin something to, this ultra-nationalist Japanese party that got quite a few votes in the last election. To some extent, this is a response to this arrival of the Chinese middle class, because it reached a scale where people actually feel that their economic opportunities are being impacted. So if that reaches that scale, then maybe there could be a problem.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you very much again for everyone to attend these discussions, to participate actively in this discussion, and we have learned, I think, a lot about the Chinese migrations. And besides the relationship between the government, the states, globalizations, and several waves of Chinese migrations, we can learn one thing, that the Chinese people are not the one group of people with one single characteristics or one set of characteristics, but it can change, and they are diverse, and they sometimes act based on how they respond to the situations that they are facing in China or in other countries. So once again, please join me in appreciating and thanking Professor Palnyeri, who has come here last night only to talk with us, and then we have to go back to the airport because Professor Nyeri will go back to Hungary, to Singapore, and then Hungary after that. So thank you so much, Professor Nyeri. Let's give him a big applause.
Yes, and I would also like to thank you again and thank you all for the good discussion and the interesting questions. I actually hope that some of you or somebody else will answer these questions, and maybe the Sinology Forum can facilitate new research on these subjects.
Yes, sure. Yeah, thank you so much, Professor.
Okay, can we give another round of applause for our speaker today? Once again, thank you, Mr. for our distinguished speaker for the perspective you shared regarding the Chinese migrations and the wave of China's re-globalizations in Southeast Asia. And also thank you to our honorable moderator, Mr. Johannes, who guided the discussions this morning. We would also like to extend our thanks to all the guests and attendees who have participated in this morning series of discussions. Please may remain seated as we will get into an appreciation session. So I would like to invite Mr. Johannes Herlianto as the founder and chairman of Indonesian Sinology Forum to give a token of appreciation for our speaker, Professor Dr. Palmin. Maybe a little to the side first. Okay. 1, 2. Ladies and gentlemen, do not forget to follow and stay tuned for FSI next seminar event through our Instagram account at Sinoforum. And also we have lunch that has been prepared for all attendees, guests, and distinguished speakers. And so with that, on behalf of Pelita Harapan University and Indonesia Sinology Forum, I, Stephanie Priscilia, will take my leave and thank you, and we'll see you at our next seminar. Good morning.